Hey everybody! Welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. This is episode number 152 of Warbird Tube, and tonight we're going to catch up with our friend Stephen Bridgewater and take a look at some images from the Duxford Air Show. If you are a Warbird enthusiast, you've heard of Duxford. Many of you have been there. It's on my bucket list, and we're going to find out more as they celebrate the 50th anniversary, which was actually last year. So we'll get into that in just a moment. But before we get started, please do us a favor. If you haven't already done so, please take a second to like, share, or subscribe and follow us. And if you're a subscriber, that is, on YouTube, just click that bell icon and you can get notifications of new episodes of Warbird Tube when they are posted. Now, Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, our aircraft, our local units, or how you can join the fun, just visit our website at commemorativeairforce.org. Well, right now, let's bring in our good friend, Stephen Bridgewater. Stephen, good to have you back here on the show.
Good to see you again, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing well. And before we get into the air shows, because that's always the fun part, let's talk a little bit about you. How did you get involved in aviation? And I know you have a pretty exciting job right now that I'd like you to share that information with our audience, if you would.
Well, I guess the same as a lot of people, the CAF that I have to thank for where I am today, I guess. I grew up with a love of aeroplanes. Nobody really knows where that comes from. There was no family history of aviation, with parents or even grandparents. Both of my grandfathers were coal miners. So during World War II, they were what's called in the UK a retained occupation. So they were down the mines. They weren't building aeroplanes or the armed forces. So there's no history at all. But I developed a love of aeroplanes. And one of the very first air shows I went to was 1988. And it was the Douglas Bader wing of then the Confederate Air Force, and to best of my knowledge, the only ever CAF air show in the UK. And I was exposed to these fantastic World War II aeroplanes that probably steered me for the career that I took. So I've spent the last 25 years as an aviation magazine editor and author. Took a bit of a career break to work in a couple of aeroplane museums. And I now work for the Royal Aeronautical Society. So I'm deputy editor on our magazine, Aerospace. Royal Aeronautical Society is the oldest aerospace society in the world. We actually formed in 1866, Steve, would you believe? So we predate the Wright brothers by about half a century. So we were formed for what was then called the furtherment of aerology. And I think aerology is a word that we really need to bring back into the modern lexicon. But we still do the same job today. So we're there to look for new technologies to promote, obviously a big push towards sustainability at the moment. AI is very topical of what we're doing, but in every field of aerospace, we've got specialist groups for everything from remotely piloted air vehicles, so UAVs, drones, commercial aircraft, military aircraft, even human-powered aircraft. So imagine the cycling along using pedal power to turn a propeller. We've got the whole gamut. But our real reason and my big passion in aerospace is encouraging that next generation in. So we've got lots of STEM and outreach to explain to people that aviation, and not just piloting, aviation as an industry is a really cool thing to be part of. And I think now of all the times, it's such an exciting time to go into aerospace as a career, whether we're going back to the moon, we're going onwards to Mars, we've got the whole sustainability challenge, we've got the urban air mobility flying taxi revolution just out of grasp at the moment, but coming. So when I speak to young people, I say, this is, forget your Formula One and your NASCAR, this is the peak of technology. And that's my soapbox, I'm afraid.
Very good. Well, let's start off with a little bit of history of Duxford itself. Obviously, Duxford as an airfield predates the air shows and played quite a pivotal role in World War II.
Well, World War One and World War Two. I mean, Duxford was actually, if I start my slides moving forwards now, hopefully you'll see from here that Duxford actually formed as an airfield in 1918. Hopefully you can all see my cursor here, but you'll see these hangars. These are the hangars that were being built. They were called the Belfast hangars. It was a type of hangar that most Royal Air Force bases had at the time. If we move forward, so this was taken in 1918. If we move forward to today, these hangars are still here. The airfield. I mean, this photograph is probably about 10 or 15 years ago. A lot of the airfield infrastructure remains at Duxford, and that's, I think, what makes it such a special location. Not just the history which has gone before you, but you are genuinely walking in that history. You're walking on the same turf that Douglas Bader walked, the 78th Fighter Group when it came across in 1942 from America. You can, particularly around the rear side of the hangars, very, very little has changed. There's still the same road markings, the same gas lamps. It is like walking back. I've been with people who said they've done a great job of making this look real. And the answer is they haven't made it real. It genuinely, this is not a Disney theme park. This is preserved as is. And we're so lucky to have this in the UK. So we go from 1918 through to today. The airfield at Duxford actually had one of its very first air shows in 1935. It's when King George V had his Silver Jubilee celebrations, and the flypast took place over the airfield. Those are 3 Hendon aeroplanes, which you can see in the photograph there. And there's another one here between the hangars. So those are the hangars that we saw on that photograph to start with. So you've got 2 rows of 2 hangars there and a hangar in the middle. This is a Fairey Hendon. So interwar biplane twin engine bomber of the Royal Air Force. And these aircraft here and out there are Avro Tutors. And that's an aeroplane we'll come back to a little bit later on, because an Avro Tutor took part in the very first modern air display which took place at Duxford, as you said earlier, Steve, 50 years ago last October, so 1973. But in the meantime, Duxford had a vital role here in the UK as one of our forefront battlefront airfields during the Battle of Britain. This is an aircraft which was, a photograph that was taken during the battle. You can see the guys here with their May Wests on waiting for the scramble. But of course, that was a Hurricane. These are Spitfires. These are the aeroplanes that people generally associate with Duxford. And these are genuine 19 Squadron aeroplanes. These were the first Spitfires that entered service with the Royal Air Force. You can see the number 19 on the tail. This photograph, I don't believe, has ever been published. This is from the Marshall Aerospace Archive. So Marshall's is based at Cambridge, so probably less than 10 miles away from Duxford itself. And Marshall's was an airfield that formed in the 1930s by the Marshall family, still going today, and it's a C-130 Hercules renovation facility and maintenance facility for lots of air arms around the world, including, I think, the US Marine Corps sent a lot of C-130s across to Cambridge to be particularly modified rather than scheduled maintenance. But this photograph was taken in 1938 at Cambridge at their opening party. Now, Duxford had just had its first Spitfires, these here from 19 Squadron. So before they appeared for the public in front of the public at Duxford, they hopped over to Cambridge, and that's where this photograph was taken. So probably one of the very first, or if not the first photograph of Spitfires at an air show. So something particularly relevant for Duxford is it's the aeroplane that you really associate with it. It's never a Duxford air show unless there's a Spitfire flying, put it that way nowadays. But some more of the guys here just at rest. I mean, it's perhaps easy to forget that a lot of the time during the battle, there were very intense periods of conflict, but also immense periods of boredom. These guys were sitting, waiting for the bell to ring. You see they've got their pet dogs there. Yeah, and Duxford has done a very good job of recreating a lot of these. So they've renovated some of the original buildings, and you get a real feel as to what it was like during that 1940 period, during the height of the Battle of Britain. But then when the bell did ring, as you can see here, there's those hangars again in the background that we've seen on all the other photographs. These are guys scrambling, ready to go off, meet the enemy coming over the English coast. And this is where they were directed from. This is 11 Group. This is the operations room at Duxford. This is where the Royal Observer Corps would radio in their sightings. There would be Heinkels coming in over. There might be Messerschmitt fighters seen over the Wash. These would be relayed, and these guys here on the radio would be passing those messages on initially to the airfields so that the crews would scramble, and then once they were in the air, vectoring the pilots towards their bandits that were coming in. Now that, I say, is at Duxford, that photograph taken during the Battle of Britain in 1940. This photograph taken in December of last year. The ops room is still there. The maps are still here. It is a real time capsule. And if you go to Duxford, please go and see this. It's included in the admission cost. A lot of people don't realize it's there, but it's behind some of the hangars. Just follow the signs for the operations room, and I promise you it is the most atmospheric thing you can imagine. They've actually got audio that plays through here now, and you can hear fighters being scrambled, the radio messages that would come through, and also the drone of the bombers flying over the top of Duxford, because of course Duxford being an airfield was a target in itself. Luckily there wasn't a huge amount of damage done to Duxford. Other airfields fared a lot worse, but Duxford did come under attack. And it was people like these that protected the airfield and protected the south of England. You may recognise the gentleman in the middle, particularly from his stance. That is the Royal Air Force's perhaps most famous fighter ace of World War II. That's Douglas Bader, the so-called legless ace. Bader lost his legs in a flying accident before the war and went on, got his license back, and was flying Spitfires with artificial legs in the Battle of Britain in 1940. Anybody want to have a quick guess as to what that is before I tell you? It's a Fiat. It's a Fiat CR42, and it is taken, that photograph is taken at Duxford. Why might an Italian aeroplane be at Duxford, you ask? Well, after the Battle of Britain, or during the Battle of Britain, really, we started to amass examples of enemy aircraft. That is a Fiat CR42, one of the few Italian aircraft that were downed in the UK during the Battle of Britain. So don't forget, it wasn't just the Germans that were attacking the mainland of the United Kingdom and Great Britain. It was the Italians as well. So that's a CR42 which force landed in the UK. It, along with a variety of other aircraft, were taken to Duxford for the enemy aircraft flight. And this is where we would evaluate the aircraft, fly them, test them, sometimes fly them against our own fighters to really see what the performance was. Later on, this facility moved from Duxford. It went to an airfield called Collie Weston, which was probably about half an hour to the north. And yeah, a remarkable series of flights that were done with everything from fighters and bombers and transports and anything that we could really get our hands on. And later in the war, these aircraft were toured around, particularly to United States Army Air Force bases, to actually take a Messerschmitt 109 or whatever the latest fighter, or Focke-Wulf 190 that we've caught, that we've managed to get an example of, take them to the crews and show them up close what this aircraft looked like and explain its capabilities. So a vital part of Duxford's history there. As is this, one of the Royal Air Force's only P-39 Aerocobras. We didn't have many Aerocobras. The Royal Air Force didn't rate it as a type. But they were tested at Duxford as part of the flight there that was looking at ways of experimenting with different types of aerial warfare. So again, the Aerocobra, a rare type which has appeared at Duxford, both in warbird terms in more recent years, thanks to the fighter collection, and here back in the 1940s. Takes us now to 1942. The Queen at the time welcoming a friendly invasion on this occasion. This was the arrival of the United States Army Air Force in 1942. 78th Fighter Group, the black and white checks, checkered noses. P-47's synonymous with Duxford. A colour shot there from the Imperial War Museum's archives. The American Air Museum at Duxford has an amazing archive which is online. If you're looking particularly for crews, histories of aircraft, histories of members, the American Air Force Museum in Britain is a remarkable asset. These are some of the photographs that they hold. And of course, as well as Thunderbolts, the iconic P-51. They're sweet and lovely, another 78th Fighter Group aeroplane. Another photograph taken at Duxford. So remarkable history that carried on after the war. So here we've got Hawker Hunter, perhaps the Spitfire of the jet age here in the UK, contemporary, I guess, with the F-86 Sabre in the US. There's the old adage, if it looks right, it flies right, and the Hunter really did look right. Remarkable aeroplane. This is a Duxford-based aeroplane. You can just see some of the airfield off to the right there. See more, and again, Duxford, there are those iconic hangars again in the background, those Belfast hangars. This aeroplane, a Gloucester Javelin, an all-weather fighter from the Royal Air Force in the 1950s. Big delta wing and a delta tail. Often was nicknamed the Flying Flatiron. If you imagine the iron that you smooth your clothes with, this is the look of the Javelin from above with that delta wing, and almost the handle of the tail was nicknamed the Flying Flatiron. So those were the last aeroplanes that were based at Duxford. So obviously it had transferred back to the Royal Air Force from the United States Army Air Force at the end of the war. Hunters and Javelins. And then it eventually passed into the hands of the Imperial War Museum. But if we look at this photograph here, so this was taken in the 1970s. So there are those hangars again, 2 and 2. These are some new hangars that have been put up to accommodate some of the Warbird, the modern day Warbirds. We've got the road now in place. That's the M11 motorway, and the roundabout there, which goes over the M11 motorway. That motorway actually cut the airfield in half. So Concorde that you can see here was one of the last aircraft to land before that was done. But what I want you to look at here is this area here. That aeroplane, you're not sure whether you can see, is actually a TSR-2, which was a prototype 1960s aeroplane here in the UK for the Royal Air Force. But the reason I'm pointing out area there is, as you can see, we've lost a hangar. What happened in 1968, the filming of the Battle of Britain took place, the movie The Battle of Britain took place at Duxford. And in doing so, they blew up that hangar. The airfield had pretty much escaped World War II without any major damage. However, a film crew in 1968 managed to blow up one of the hangars, and that space is still there today. Here you can see one of the Casa 211s, the Spanish license-built Heinkel 111s, also some of the Hispano Buchons, and a Hawker Hurricane there, and a Spitfire. And that there is Duxford's control tower. This photograph was taken during filming in 1968, ready for the film to come out in 1969. If you've seen the movie Battle of Britain, you may remember the opening scenes. The French chateau, that was actually built at Duxford for the filming. It wasn't a genuine French chateau. I'll say they built it. They kind of built half a chateau, as you can see there. But I think this takes the history of Duxford that step further. So we've had the First World War in 1918 when the airfield was built. We had the interwar period where it was home to, we saw King George V's Silver Jubilee. We've seen the wartime years. We've seen the post-war years there with the Javelin and the Hunter. And now we come into that period of the 60s where it's being used as a film set. At that point, Duxford really was left to wreck and ruin. The Air Force didn't need it. The film crew didn't need it anymore. At one point, Duxford Airfield was going to be turned into a prison camp. It was a big expanse of area. But luckily, the Imperial War Museum decided that this would be the ideal outpost for some of its collection of aeroplanes. In the early days, there was no real thought given to flying aeroplanes from Duxford in the way that we do now as warbirds. It was more about having hangar facilities for some of the large aircraft that the Imperial War Museum was now collecting. So the Imperial War Museum was formed after the First World War, headquartered at Lambeth in central London. Some of you may have been to IWM, the Imperial War Museum in Lambeth. Again, a remarkable facility, but not a big building. So once you've started to collect a number of aeroplanes, they needed to go somewhere, and Duxford was the place that they went. And so we come to October the 14th, 1973, the first of what we would call the modern day Duxford air shows. So Duxford, on a general year, up until recently, would have about 3 air shows a year. The 2-day show in May, 1 in September, 1 in October, and then also the Flying Legends event, which took place in July. In recent years, that's changed. There are now 2 major air shows and also a series of flying days, which are smaller afternoon flying. But back in 1973, this was the only event. It took place October 1973. So what did we have in the flying display? I say we. I wasn't there. Duxford 1992 was my first Duxford. So this took place in 73. I wasn't born until 75. So I'm going here on information I've gained from various people, including some photographs you'll see shortly from Gordon Riley, who's very kindly allowed me to share them with you. But this is a copy of the flying programme for that show in 1973. So Avro Lancaster, what was then the RAF, now the Royal Air Force's Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. They also bought a Spitfire and a Hurricane. English Electric Canberra, still in service with the Royal Air Force at the time. A Hunting Percival Provost, that's the piston-powered Provost, Shuttleworth collection aeroplane. A C-130 Hercules from the Air Force. Avro Tutor. What else have we got over here? We've got a de Havilland Dove. That was part of the Civil Aviation Authority. So that was an aeroplane that was used by the CAA, our equivalent of the FAA in the US, and it was used for calibrating radar approaches and approach aids. A Dakota, it's not an air show without a DC-3 or a C-47, is it? A Hunter, quite apt, seeing as the Hunter was the last jet fighter to be served to serve at Duxford. Unfortunately, the Gladiator didn't turn up. We lost the Gladiator from the Shuttleworth collection, didn't turn up on the day. That's from the aeroplanes that went tech, as we say. Vickers Varsity, Royal Air Force transport aeroplane, also used a lot for training multi-engine crews. That was in the flying display. And then the what would later become the Fleet Air Arm historic flights. So this is our flying within the Royal Navy, nowadays called a charity called Navy Wings. They brought along their Fairey Swordfish, the biplane, also a Hawker Sea Fury, and a Fairey Firefly. And then an aeroplane that we've longed to see for many years, the de Havilland Mosquito, an aeroplane which is now making a comeback thanks to our friends down in New Zealand. The last flying Mosquito in the UK took part in the air show at Duxford. Also some gliding, Westland Scout helicopter, that's from the Army Air Corps. So it's interesting, we've got representation here from the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy and the Army Air Corps, so the 3 main services here in the UK. So those are the aircraft that we had. So look now at which ones we've still got around 50 years later. So the Avro Tutor, that was on the list there from the Shuttleworth collection, and then Miles Magister, they're both still with the Shuttleworth collection. Percival Provost, that aeroplane at the time belonged to the Shuttleworth collection. It's been sold. It's no longer flown. Shuttleworth collection have a different Provost now, but the one that came to the first air show has been sold and is now a static exhibit. Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, they bought their Spitfire Mark V, one of their Mark II Hurricanes, and the Lancaster, all of those surviving aeroplanes. The Swordfish, that's still around. Unfortunately, the Fleet Air Arm have lost both the Sea Fury and the Firefly. The Firefly, tragically, in a fatal accident at Duxford. The Sea Fury, luckily, in it was an interesting incident with John Beattie, actually, with that Sea Fury, in that he had one wheel up and one wheel down. So he got the problem with the aircraft, and the pilot's operating notes for the Sea Fury say, if you're in that situation, you bail out. So he took the aeroplane out over the North Sea and successfully bailed out. The Mosquito, again, sadly lost. We lost that aeroplane in the UK in 1996. The Dakota that was there is still around. It's in Colombia, so it was a bit of a long way to bring that one back for the air show, I guess. We can perhaps let them off on that one. And the de Havilland Dove that flew in the flying display was actually scrapped in 1983. At that point, Doves were common aeroplanes. There weren't many airfields in the UK that weren't littered with de Havilland Doves. So that was our warbirds. What about the military aeroplanes? Well, there was the Gloucester Meteor that took part in the show on static display. That's now on static display at Liverpool's John Lennon Airport. The Varsity, that's static display. The nose of that aircraft has been kept. That's at the South Yorkshire Air Museum. The Canberra that took place in the flying display was written off in an accident, luckily a non-fatal accident in 1978. The Hunter is still around. That's being restored to static in a museum in Suffolk. The Wasp, there was a Wasp from the helicopter from the Fleet Air on that took part in the flying display, and fittingly, it's now on display at Duxford, which I think is great. The two Scouts, so the Wasp and the Scout, very, very similar helicopters. The way to tell them apart is the Scout, the Army's aircraft, had a skid undercarriage, whereas the Wasp had wheel undercarriage for landing on the aircraft carrier. Got what I would refer to as shopping trolley wheels that cast around, so you can move it around on the deck. The Hercules, the C-130, that aircraft was retired by the Royal Air Force, sent back to Lockheed Martin in the US, and was eventually scrapped in 2001. That aeroplane's not around. And of the jet provosts, one was written off in a, again, luckily non-fatal mid-air collision, and the other two are still around but not flying. So in terms of aeroplanes that could come back for the 50th anniversary, a little bit limited. So move on. Static display, number of aircraft. This was the fledgling Imperial War Museum. So this is the first aeroplanes that they started to collect at Duxford as part of what would now become the massive 5 hangars full of aeroplanes that you see when you come to Duxford. Interestingly there, the Australia P11, the Shackleton is still there. There's prototype Beagle Pup, and there's Vampires, Venoms, Sea Vixen, and another Dove, and a P-51 Mustang. That aeroplane was restored at Duxford. There it is. And that was restored to go back down to London and spent the subsequent 45 years hanging from the roof of the Imperial War Museum in Lambeth in London. Painted 78 fighter group scheme. That aircraft in the last few years has returned to Duxford and now hangs from the ceiling within the American Air Museum. So that's an airplane to come full circle. And I think just in black and white, it's quite an atmospheric photograph. It could be taken in 1944 with those hangar doors, those original 1940s hangar doors in the background. So these are photographs taken by Gordon Riley. Gordon's allowed me to share these with you today. That's an aeroplane that flew in for static display. That was the last airworthy Gloucester Javelin. So again, we talked about the Hunter and the Javelin being the last two operational types to fly from Royal Air Force Duxford, as was. That, as you can see, was not an operational Javelin. That was an aeroplane that was used by the Aircraft and Armaments Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down in the southwest of the country on trials work, which is why it's in that garish red and white scheme. And satisfyingly, that aeroplane now is at Duxford as well. So if you walk into Hangar 4 at Duxford, you will see XH897, that red and white Javelin. Not the prettiest aeroplane, but it certainly uses character. That is the Fairy Gannet, again, a Fleet Air Arm aeroplane of the 1950s and 60s. That's an aeroplane which had just flown into Duxford for the Imperial War Museum just before the first air show. It's still there. It's in Hangar 3. If you ever see the Gannets up close from the front, I know there's one example which has flown in the US relatively recently, came into EAA at Oshkosh probably about 10 years ago. It's got the most remarkable wing folding, which looks like a Venetian blind with a concertina of wings. Obviously, to get it below deck on the carrier, the Gannet is a big aeroplane and a twin-engined aeroplane. So that's the reason it's got these contra-rotating propellers on the front. It's got the Armstrong Siddeley Mamba, double Mamba engine. So the beauty of this is once the aircraft was off the carrier, it could shut down one engine, feather one of these propellers, and therefore increase its endurance. And this was a submarine hunting aeroplane originally. So perhaps one of those aeroplanes which is perhaps typically British, should we say, more character than prettiness. That's the Oster AOP9 again, which just formed part of the Imperial War Museum collection. Now this is inside one of those Belfast hangars. You can see in the top here the truss work, the wooden trusses, and if you walk into the hangars today, you'll still see that unusual structure. This was one of the later marks of Oster. The Oster was designed in the early 40s as an airborne observation aircraft, what we called an airborne observation post, an AOP aircraft here in the UK. So the equivalent of the L4 Grasshopper in the US. This is a much later version, big, powerful flaps and a big engine. This is an aeroplane that can get in and out of short strips, fly very, very slowly. And still a relatively popular aeroplane with private pilots today, although age is catching up with it. I'm going to take a guess at there being probably less than 10 AOP9s left flying in the world. Gloucester Meteor F8, an aeroplane that flew from Duxford just in the post-war years. WK991 was one of those aeroplanes, and it is now at Duxford. You can see that aeroplane again in Hangar 4. But here, it's photographed 50 years ago. Another aeroplane which is typically British. So this is the prototype of the Beagle 206X, which was perhaps the most advanced variant of the Beagle Basset. So Beagle aircraft was a light aircraft manufacturer here in the UK post-war years. In a way, a development of the Oster company, which you saw that AOP9 a few minutes ago. So the company built the single-engine Pup, which we'll see shortly, and also the twin-engined Beagle Basset. Now, the Basset was a heavy aeroplane. This was designed to compete with the Cessna 310s, Piper Aztecs of this world, but it was heavy. It was a really, really heavy aeroplane, and it was over-spec'd. I once saw some design documentation because although it was marketed as to the civilian market, it was designed as a military crew transport for the V-Force. So the V-Force in the UK was the Vulcan, the Victor, and the Valiant, are V-bombers that were designed to carry our nuclear deterrent, so B-52 era. And this was designed as an aeroplane to take the V-bomber crews to the dispersed airfields. And the door aperture, which sadly you can't see on here because it's got this tarpaulin over it, I've seen paperwork which says the door aperture was designed to allow access for a Royal Air Force officer, full ceremonial mess dress, complete with ceremonial sword, which meant the aeroplane was completely over-engineered for probably 1% of its actual need. So needless to say, the Basset was not the most successful of British aeroplanes, but one of the loveliest to fly. This is the Beagle Pup. This is actually the prototype of Beagle Pup. Golf, Alpha Victor, Delta Foxtrot. So obviously all British aircraft have the G as the suffix for their registration. This was the very first Beagle Pup. Beautiful red and white aeroplane. In the last 5 or so years, this aeroplane has been restored to fly and is now based at Toweston, down in the south of the UK. And great to see the interest in that 1960s era of aircraft re-emerging. Particularly with, there are a number of Beagle Pups around. It's an aeroplane I've flown myself, lovely aeroplane, again, generally underpowered, overweight. It's a 2-seater. Technically it's a 4-seater, but it's a 2-seater. It was never going to compete with the Cessna 172s of this world. But it's a pretty aeroplane and it's beautiful to fly. And later went on to become the Bulldog. So there was an aerobatic version of this. When Beagle went into bankruptcy, filed for the equivalent of Chapter 11, the rights were bought by Scottish Aviation and turned into the Scottish Aviation Bulldog, which is a trainer that the Royal Air Force used for a long time. A DC-3, C-47. This is an ex-Royal Air Force aeroplane that's actually being restored at Duxford at the air show. It's again, you see that beautiful wooden ceiling in the Belfast Truss hangar. This is Golf Alpha November Alpha Fox, an aeroplane that I became closely associated with later in its life, something I'll talk about a bit later on. Also at Duxford 50 years ago, in 1973, was this Spitfire. It's a Spitfire Mark V. Its registration is AR501, and the real enthusiasts amongst you may know that is the Shuttleworth Collection Spitfire. A Mark V, an early Mark V. It had flown in the Battle of Britain movie in the 1960s, so late 60s, and was now at Duxford being fully renovated, fully restored by volunteers from Duxford and the Shuttleworth Collection, ready to return to the air and go back to where it was based at Old Warden at the Shuttleworth Collection. That aeroplane has been a stalwart of the British air show scene for the last 50 years. Spent the last probably just short of a decade being restored again at Duxford, at Old Warden, now a regular again at the Shuttleworth Collection. Interesting history on this aeroplane. It was built by the Westland Aeroplane Company, flew with a number of squadrons, mostly Czech crewed squadrons during World War II. And in amongst its history, this aeroplane actually escorted the Memphis Belle on one of its missions. So that great example again of that camaraderie and assistance between Royal Air Force and United States Air Force or Army Air Force crews. So a really, really historic aeroplane there, and seen at Duxford in 1973. This is another aeroplane that had just arrived for the fledgling Imperial War Museum, not a Junkers 52. It's actually a Portuguese licensed built version, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but it is effectively a Ju-52 built under license. That aeroplane now resides in Poland at the Polish National Aerospace Museum in Krakow. That aeroplane restored at Duxford into immaculate condition and later sold on to Poland. Now, that might look like a boat. It's not, it's an aeroplane. It's a Miles Magister. So the Miles Magister monoplane, World War II trainer, think Fairchild PT-19, that sort of twin tandem cockpit, open cockpit, low wing monoplane. That was an aeroplane, as you can see, was being actively restored at Duxford on the day of that first air show in 1973. And a de Havilland Dove. We spoke earlier about the Dove, which flew in the flying display from the Civil Aviation Unit. This is a similar aeroplane. This aeroplane had recently been donated to Duxford, the Imperial War Museum. This aeroplane now hangs from the ceiling of Hangar 1, the airspace hangar, in these markings. Although, don't believe everything you see in photographs. This, as it says on the tail, is Golf Alpha Lima Foxtrot Tango. It is not. Actually, the aeroplane at the Imperial War Museum is Fox uniform. And for some reason, this has got a different rudder on it. I'm yet to find out the reasoning for that. I'm guessing probably it was swapped because it was a more serviceable rudder than the one that was on the original Fox Tango. But a good example there of research, and don't necessarily believe seeing photographs. So that was 50 years ago. We fast forward now 50 years to last October, so October the 14th, 2023, exactly 50 years. And as we say here, we're big cricket fans in the UK, we say 50 not out. A good innings is 50 not out. And Duxford have managed 50 years of air shows, remarkable air shows. I could speak for a week on the impact that Duxford has had on the UK air show scene, from Flying Legends to some of the early Warbird displays. We haven't got time to do that, so I'm going to look at, having looked at the very first Duxford Air Show, we'll look at the most recent Duxford Air Show, which was, fittingly enough, the 50th anniversary. This is the look down the flight line. You can see the PBY Catalina there. This is the super hangar, as was. It's now the airspace hangar, home to British and Commonwealth aeroplanes, and also a restoration facility on the end. So, this is a view inside that hangar. What have we got here? Avro Vulcan gives you probably some idea of size as to how big this facility is. That's an English electric Canberra hanging from the ceiling. There's a Mosquito over here on the right hand side. the unmistakable shape of Concorde, one of the pre-production Concordes. And this aeroplane, perhaps one of the most controversial in the UK aviation history, this is the TSR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance Aircraft Design Number 2. Aircraft designed in the 1950s and scrapped by the government, rightly or wrongly. There are pros and cons. Some people will say that it was the greatest aeroplane we never had. Some people will claim that it was a white elephant. I think, irrespective, everyone can agree that it was a beautiful aeroplane. This was scrapped because the Royal Air Force was intending to buy the F-111 instead. That aeroplane didn't happen. So there was a significant capability, or that acquisition didn't happen rather. So there was a significant capability gap until we eventually got an aeroplane that could replace the TSR-2. So that is the airspace hangar. I think this might be an aeroplane that CAF recognise. This is the only B-29 exhibited in the UK and in Europe. This is in the American Air Museum. So back in the late 1990s, money was raised to create the American Air Museum. This stunning, you see the concrete building here with a big glass frontage. It's a teardrop-shaped building that was designed around a B-52. So you can just see the tail there of the B-52. Classic World War II aeroplanes, P-51, P-47 hanging from the ceiling. You can see here a C-47 hanging from the ceiling, a U-2, SR-71. It really is one of the most incredible display hangars in any aeroplane museum anywhere in the world. And I say that as somebody who's been lucky to travel extensively. There are some very good museums around the world, and I think this is one of the best laid out and best thought through display areas that I've been to. You can get very close to the aeroplanes, and the exhibits talk of the personal history behind not just that airframe, but the aircraft in general. So there's lots of social history that goes with it, including a section of the Berlin War, which really puts the Cold War into context. And in terms of context, outside the hangar, as you walk up around that beautiful concrete dome, there is this stunning glass memorial. And each one of these aeroplanes represents an aircraft lost, flown by American crews from British soil during World War II. And it is an incredibly sobering and thought-provoking memorial when you think how many crew were on each of these aeroplanes. And this wall, this glass wall, goes on and on and on and on. And I think it's something, when I'm taking people to the museum for the first time, that I always stop and point out the relevance of, because it is just an incredible, provoking and tasteful, not even exhibit. It's a piece of artwork. It really is. So we'll look at the air show now. If you had told anybody in 1973 at that Duxford air show, that very first Duxford air show, that there would be a Hawker Tempest at the airfield 50 years later, I think they would have laughed. I think if you'd said this to anybody 5 years ago, they probably would have laughed. This has probably been one of the most eagerly anticipated aircraft restorations in UK warbird history. The Tempest, one of the most advanced piston engine fighters ever to come out of the United Kingdom, forerunner of the Sea Fury, which you probably will be aware of. Didn't have extensive service in the UK. It came in towards the end of World War II and was rapidly overtaken by the early jet aircraft. So a number of aircraft were gifted to the Indian Air Force. These were aircraft that were already out in India. They'd been out there as part of the Pacific campaign. And these aircraft were flown briefly by the Indians and then became airfield decoys. And in the 1970s, a founder warbird collector in the UK by the name of Doug Arnold, Warbirds of Great Britain, collected a number of these aircraft and brought them back to the UK. It's taken from the 1970s until September of last year to get one of these aircraft airworthy. There've been a number of false starts or a number of restoration projects around the world. There's one in Canada, which is very close to now. But this is almost the holy grail of British warbirds, and it flew just in time to appear on static display at the 50th anniversary Duxford Air Show. So I think for many people, this was one of the highlights of the day, if not the highlight of the day. It had only flown once, it hadn't finished its flight test campaign, so it wasn't able to fly in the display, but we're looking forward to seeing this aeroplane fly at British air shows this year. And it really is a dream come true for aviation enthusiasts. Another view of what is simply a stunning aeroplane. It's an aeroplane, I think, which just says power. You know, it's got a Bristol Centaurus engine, so a sleeve valve radial engine, a very complicated engine. And although it looks similar to the Sea Fury, my understanding, having spoken to some of the team involved in rebuilding it, it's a very, very, very different beast. More in common with the Hawker Typhoon than the later Sea Fury. So, Hawker aeroplane, you know, the end of the Hawker piston engine fighter lineage before you went on to the early jets. So the Hawker, well, ultimately you'd move on to the Hunter, but the Seahawk onto the Hunter. So at the end of the piston powers the Hawkers. Now we look at the start of that Hawker powered fighter lineage. And again, we talked about the Spitfire, we talked about the Hawker Hunter maybe being the Spitfire of the jet age. I'd perhaps go as far as saying that the Hawker Fury, the Spitfire of that interwar, glorious silver-winged fighter days. Yeah, a beautiful aeroplane, powered by the Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, so in many ways the forerunner of the Merlin. This aeroplane restored by Guy Black's collection, Aero Vintage, operated by his Historic Aircraft Corporation at Duxford. Been out of the air now for the last 5 or 6 years with extensive work. Didn't fly in the flying display, but did fly before the air show on an air test on that 50th anniversary show. And the chance there to see a Hawker Fury and a Hawker Tempest 2 alongside each other at the 50th anniversary Duxford Air Show was gold, aviation gold, it really was. So, what did we have in the flying display? Sun, as you can see, one of the downsides of Duxford as an airshow venue, for most of the day, particularly when you get into that September-October period, you are shooting into sun. So you have a number of silhouetted aeroplanes. There are ways and means to get around this. You can make it black and white, various effects. But as you saw there, a Hawker Hurricane and 2 Spitfires, aircraft that are synonymous with Duxford, synonymous with Duxford air shows, and perhaps only fitting that they opened that 50th anniversary air show. 2 Mark I Spitfires as well. So the aeroplane off to our right here, a relatively new restoration for Dan Friedkin's Comanche fighters based here in the UK at Duxford. This one up here, Spitfire Mark 1A, and one of the earliest restorations of Spitfires, again owned nowadays by Comanche fighters, Dan Friedkin, based at Duxford, but that aeroplane has been flying at British air shows in the 60s in a number of colour schemes through a number of operators. And although the Duxford Air Show in October last year was marking 50 years of Duxford Air Shows, for me, I think it was important to look back at the almost 50 years of Warbird shows, and to have that aeroplane, which is AR213, on display, I think was a very clever move by the organisers and a very apt and appropriate thing to see. Like any air show, it's not just Warbirds. This is Diana Britton flying her CAP 232. Avion Moudry aeroplane, a French aerobatic aeroplane, a number of those flying in the US. I'm sure you've seen them at Oshkosh and various events. Diana Britton, one of our leading aerobatic pilots, I guess you'd say almost the equivalent of Patty Wagstaff in terms of fame amongst the aviation community here in the UK. Not an original aeroplane, sadly. No original Fokker DR ones left in airworthy condition or at all. But this aeroplane, replica, flown by and owned by Paul Ford, based at Duxford. This aeroplane's a relatively newly built replica, but painted, of course, in the markings of the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, perhaps the most famous fighter pilot of World War I, certainly most famous German fighter pilot of World War I. And again, for me, I don't know whether this was a deliberate inclusion in the flying display, but this harked back to an aeroplane that flew in the early days of Duxford in the 80s, a replica flown by Robin Bowes. Again, Robin sadly no longer with us, but to have this aeroplane there, certainly for those of us that remember those Duxford air show of the 80s, 90s period, was a really special thing to see, and you know, a beautifully flown display as well. And again, an aeroplane type synonymous with Duxford air shows. The consolidated PBY-5A Catalina. This is actually a Canadian Vickers aeroplane, a Canso, operated by a syndicate that are based at Duxford. So this aeroplane flying in the markings of the United States Army Air Force Catalina, that was used in the air sea rescue role. It's got nose art on the side of the fuselage there. It's called Miss Pickup. The only PBY Catalina flying in Europe now. And again, there has been a Catalina based at Duxford since I'm going to say about 1985. I think the first Catalina arrived, and an aeroplane which, if you're going to mark 50 years of Duxford air shows, it's really important that you have a PBY. Now, this is an aeroplane type which flew in that first display 50 years ago in 1973. This is a jet provost. So we talked earlier about the piston provost. This was the jet provost, which was the evolution of the piston radial powered aeroplane. So it had the radial had an engine called the Leonidas, an Alvis Leonidas engine on the front. That was then converted into a jet powered tricycle undercarriage jet provost. This was the later Mark. This is the Mark V. So a pressurized canopy, tip tanks. And this was the sort of aeroplane that was flown at the first display by one of the Royal Air Force display teams of the day. So this is a privately owned example now, flown at the display. You can tell by the yellow helmet there that it's Chris Heames, ex-Royal Air Force pilot, now flies the majority of the UK's classic jets. So a fitting aeroplane, and the first example we've seen of an aeroplane type which flew in that display in 1973. Now, Duxford has always been good at introducing new pilots to display flying. I think that photograph's a bit overblown. It looks a bit blurry there. I apologise for that. It looked fine on the smaller screen. These aeroplanes are Taylor monoplanes, a classic British home-built aeroplane, and they are being flown as part of what's called Team Mono, and they are flown by Ben Gilmore and Bruce Buglass, who are, would you believe, 21 years old. This was their first season as display pilots, and as somebody who's been going to Duxford for many years now, I've seen a number of pilots make their first displays at Duxford and then go on to great things. You know, we think of the late great Mark Hanna, kind of Richard Grace, Dave Pulliston, a number of people who are familiar now as Warbird pilots that cut their teeth on small aeroplanes flying their first displays at Duxford. So it's great to see, in the 50th anniversary, it's great to see Duxford not just tipping the hat back at those pilots who've come through before, but also providing opportunities for that next generation of what we call tyro display pilots, so new display pilots in their first season. Now, you may remember I showed you this photograph, what feels like a lifetime ago now, it's probably about 20 minutes ago. This is Golf Alpha November Alpha Fox, C-47 Dakota, Skytrain, Goonie Bird, call it what you will. That aeroplane was being restored at Duxford in 1973. That's where it is seen. It would later return to airworthy condition and later joined the Air Atlantique company. And this is where I crossed paths with the aeroplane. So in addition to being an aerospace journalist, I've spent a number of years working for Air Atlantique with its historic flights, setting up a couple of museums and being lucky enough to fly in a number of their aircraft, including Golf Alpha November Alpha Fox. Now, the Air Atlantique classic flight disbanded a few years ago. Our founder and patron retired, the aircraft was sold, and Ganath, Golf Alpha November Alpha Fox, that you see here, still flies, and here she is at Duxford, 50 years later, taking to the air in the markings of a Royal Air Force D-Day aeroplane to the D-Day stripes. This aeroplane didn't fly in D-Day, the original aeroplane, although it did fly in the Berlin airlift. So it's now owned by a company at North Weald, Aero Heritage, who are using it for a number of purposes, including flights this year. This aeroplane will be flying over the D-Day beaches as part of the Dakotas over D-Day, Dakotas to Norway, Dakotas to D-Day trip, which I know the CAF is very, very involved in, and we are very grateful for you for doing it. So Ganaf is owned by the same organisation which own a number of two-seat and single-seat Spitfires. They are one of the pioneers in this country of the two-seat rides campaign with Spitfire. You can pay your hard-earned money and have your flight of a lifetime in a Spitfire. Not this one. This is a single-seater being flown by Charlie Brown, who's now got more than 1,000 hours flying Spitfires. This is TD314, which is a Mark 9 Spitfire, but flew a lovely pairs display on the day last October with the very historic Dakota, excuse me, that had flown 50 years to the day at the same show. Not the only Spitfire at Duxford, pleased to say. We'd seen the two Mark 1s earlier. We've just seen a Mark 9. This aeroplane, a Mark 19, so the most advanced variant of the Spitfire currently flying. There are projects underway to restore later examples, but at the moment, the Mark 19, the pinnacle of Spitfire development that's in the air. This aeroplane, as you can see on the nose, is owned by Rolls-Royce, the aero engine company, although it is previously an aircraft operated by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Now, we saw on the list earlier that the BBMF, Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, did appear at that first air show in 1973. Now, unfortunately, the way the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight season works now is that by October, the aircraft have finished their flying season. They're entering their winter maintenance period. So sadly, the BBMF were not able to support Duxford's 50th anniversary show with the very aeroplanes that appeared 50 years previously. However, this is an ex-Battle of Britain Memorial Flight aeroplane, and on the day, it was being flown by Mark Discom, codenamed Disco. Disco is the operational commander, the OC of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. So although they weren't there with their own aeroplanes, Disco and a previous BBMF Spitfire were on site to entertain the crowds. And if you've ever seen a Mark 19 Spitfire, I'm sure the CAF has its own Mark 14, so a big Griffin-powered Spitfire. It really is a beast of an aeroplane. This aeroplane, PR aircraft, photo reconnaissance, so flying in the PR blue for high altitude reconnaissance over occupied Germany. This aeroplane having flown just that, a number of operational missions over Germany during the latter months of World War II. The one good thing with Duxford is you can get relatively close to the aeroplanes. This is taken from an area which is colloquially known as the tank bank. And one of the hangars at Duxford is devoted at the moment to land warfare. It's called the Land Warfare Hall. So tanks, armoured cars. And as part of that, they've got a track where you can actually go and ride in an armoured car. Now, there's just a big earth embankment that surrounds that. And by standing on the side of that bank, hence the tank bank, you can get these wonderful shots down onto the end of the taxiway and see the aircraft taxiing past you. So this is Disco taxiing in the Mark 19 Spitfire. And then you see taxis past, you see that's the control tower, and that's the big airspace hangar at the end, which is the one that's got the Vulcan and the Concorde inside it. You can see it was a beautiful day. I've been to some Duxford air shows which have not been beautiful weather. Luckily, on this occasion, the weather gods were kind to us. More civilian acrobatics. This was Team Titan, so sponsored by Titan Airways here in the UK. So a Citabria, and this aeroplane here, which is an Extreme 41. So two very different types of aeroplane, two very different types of aerobatic style, but flown really well as a formation duo. Again, one of the newer teams on the circuit. Great to see Duxford giving some exposure to some of the up-and-coming airshow acts in amongst the warbirds that we all go to Duxford to see. And I think it's the amount of pilots who have transitioned from the civilian aerobatic world into the warbird world. It's great to see them recognised at this event. Now, this is an aeroplane that wasn't at Duxford in 1973, but it was at Duxford throughout the 1980s. This Beech Staggerwing aeroplane, now owned by Peter Kuipers, well known for flying the B-17 Sally B. He's recently acquired this aeroplane from Rob's Lamplow, well-known warbird collector in the UK in the 1980s and 90s. This aeroplane was based at Duxford with Rob's for many, many years. Painted at an unusual Royal Air Force scheme. This was actually a scheme applied to an aeroplane used by the Dutch Prince Bernhard as his effectively run-around aeroplane when he was in exile in the UK. So this aeroplane now is used by Peter to commute from mainland Europe over to the UK when he's flying aircraft out of Duxford, particularly Sally B. And he really flies the Staggerwing well. Not an aerobatic type, but really getting the aeroplane up to some high angles of bank during his display in October. The Flying Comrades, another civilian team that took part in the show in October. Two Yak 52s on the wing and leading a Yak 18T. Ex-Soviet bloc aeroplanes, the 52s, military training aeroplanes. The 18T developed as a civilian training aeroplane, particularly Aeroflot, but it's a 4-seat aerobatic aeroplane. So the Flying Comrades, flown by Tom Turner, Alex Luton, and David Hardesty. Tom Turner, actually the airfield manager at Duxford, and Tom is very gracious in allowing the display box, the airspace at Duxford, to be used by up-and-coming teams to practice their displays. There we see that the aeroplanes. You'll notice that traditionally these aircraft have had red stars. Due to the climate in Ukraine at the moment and the general feeling here in the UK, those red stars have been obliterated on both the 52s and on the Yak 18T, replaced here with the British Union flag on the 18T. Again, beautiful sky, beautiful low evening sun. By now, that harsh into sun photography has passed. The sun has moved around over your shoulder a little bit. And as I say, the 18T, a fully aerobatic aeroplane, and quite the display aircraft. It's very unusual to see an aeroplane that's almost the size of a beach bonanza flying aerobatics. Now, remember earlier we said it's not a boat, it's actually a plane. This is a Miles Magister. This photograph, I said, taken 1973 at the very first Duxford Air Show. This aeroplane was later restored to airworthy condition, and fittingly, it took part in the 50th anniversary air show. Quite the transition, as you can see. As I said, it's very similar in configuration to a PT-19. So Gypsy major engine, the same as you would find on a Tiger Moth. Flaps, very unusual at this time to have flaps on a Royal Air Force training aeroplane. And great to see an aeroplane that was there, like that C-47 that was there 50 years ago, taking part in the flying display, having been fully restored. Now, 50 years ago, Shuttleworth brought this aeroplane with them as well to Duxford. This is the Avro Tutor, a precursor, I guess, of the de Havilland Tiger Moth that you may be familiar with. Quite similar to a Stearman in its configuration, with a big radial engine on the front. So, you know, a beautiful aeroplane. The only one in existence. There aren't even any more in museums. That is the only surviving Avro Tutor. Unfortunately, on the morning of the air show, it refused to start. It went tech, so it was not able to make the short journey across from the old Warden base of the Shuttleworth collection to Duxford. So, fittingly, they decided to bring their second Miles Magister. So this is the collection's own Miles Magister. The yellow one we saw 2 slides ago is privately owned, but based at the Shuttleworth collection. So there aren't many places in the world where you can see 2 Miles Magisters taking to the sky. There are currently 5 airworthy Miles Magisters in the entire world. 4 of those are in the UK. 1 of them is in the Czech Republic. We were lucky, I think 2 years ago now, to get all 5 together at Old Warden at the Shuttleworth collection. The Czech aircraft had recently been imported from Argentina, had been rebuilt here in the UK, and before it went out to its owners in the Czech Republic, we managed to get all 5 together, and that really was a treat for the hardened aviation enthusiast. Sticking on the trainer theme and sticking on the new pilot theme, it's a T6, it's a Harvard as we would call it here in the UK. This aeroplane, Canadian built Harvard 2B, painted up in the markings of the Royal Air Force. This is an aeroplane that was restored at Duxford. It was restored by the fighter collection. So Stephen Gray's collection of Warbirds that goes back to 1983, 1984 in the UK. But this aircraft was recently sold, and it was sold to Isabel Rutland. And Isabel, very competent aerobatic competition pilot here in the UK. And she's had this aeroplane now for 2 or 3 years. And the reason she bought this aeroplane is because she has been training herself up for her new acquisition, which is a P-51. And just before Christmas last year, her P-51 arrived in the UK. It's an aeroplane called Marinelle, based in the UK, was restored and based in the UK for a number of years in the early 2000s, was sold to Italy about 10 years ago now, and has now returned. Isabel is basing the aeroplane at Duxford for the time being. But this aeroplane, this Harvard, this was Isabel's first T6 display at Duxford. And great, as I said earlier, great to see these new pilots coming through, especially with the connection here to an aeroplane which has got a long Duxford history. Another T6. So we've gone from a new pilot to, I'm sure Rod, if he's listening, won't mind me calling him an old pilot. Rod has been displaying aeroplanes in the UK for more than 5 decades. He's Rod Dean, stalwart of the British air show scene. Somebody that I grew up admiring, and Rod is somebody I've been privileged to know in my writing career and got to know very well. And to go off on a very brief tangent, as a young 17-year-old, I wrote to a warbird collector here in the UK called Spencer Flack, asking to take photographs of his P-51. And I got a letter back in 1992 from Rod Dean saying, why don't you come and join us at Duxford for the day? And again, the same way that the CAF inspired me a few years earlier to follow that interest in historic aircraft and warbirds, Rod's hospitality that day and his enthusiasm really set me on a career. And about 18 months ago, I got a phone call from Rod, who'd been clearing his desk. And I'm not saying Rod's desk is untidy, but he found that original letter signed by Stephen Bridgewater, aged 17 years old. And I now have that letter back in my collection, having come full circle from Rod. So this is Rod flying a T6. This is an aeroplane called Taz. The markings of the Portuguese Air Force. This is an ex-Portuguese aircraft. So having had Isabel making her first display in Harvard in the UK in a Duxford Air Show, we then jumped to Rod flying in air shows now for 5 decades. And he flew with Nigel Wilson, another very experienced T6 pilot, in a pairs display. So this US Navy marked aeroplane, and that's Taz leading the formation. But it's the warbirds you really want to hear about, isn't it? Hawker Hurricane, Mark 1. If ever there was a type synonymous with Duxford, Spitfires and Hurricanes have to be right up there with a black and white checkerboard P-51 Mustang. This aeroplane, Mark 1 Hurricane, restored recently in the UK for originally for Rick Roberts. He sold it before it was completed to Graham Peacock's collection, which is now operated by Air Leasing at Sywell and at Duxford. This aeroplane splits its time between Sywell Aerodrome in Northamptonshire, which is having a big air show in June of this year. If you get a chance to come across for that, it's looking amazing. And it splits the second half of its year at Duxford. So you're getting airborne for its display. You can see the black and white undersides that were painted to aircraft during the Battle of Britain. These were, in the early parts of the battle, recognition markings. So let's just say some of the ground-to-air gunners were a little trigger happy. And if you saw that the aeroplane had a black and white underside, you knew it was friendly, you knew not to shoot at it. Second Hurricane getting airborne. Again, an aeroplane that's been at Duxford many, many years. First restored at Duxford and flew in 1990 in time for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. This aeroplane, G. Hurry, it's an ex-Canadian Mark 12, was restored by the Fighter Collection, now owned by and operated by Guy Black's historic aircraft collection at Duxford. And there we see the third Hurricane. So this at the bottom here is the one we've just seen taking off. At the top here is an aircraft owned by Syndicate at Duxford. This is again another Mark 1 Hurricane. This is Hurricane 501 as it's known. 501 referring to 501 Squadron, the squadron which this very Hurricane flew with during the Battle of Britain. So 3 Hurricanes taking to the skies, 2 genuine Mark 1s, a Mark 12 with extensive warbird history as well. So this, the historic aircraft collection aircraft carrying the later scheme with the duckhead blue underneath. By this time they dispensed with the black and white undersides. Now we reach the end of the display, the finale of the display. And if anything says Duxford air shows to me, it's big piston fighters, and none more so than the Sea Fury and the Bearcat. Maybe the Corsair, maybe the Thunderbolt. So it was fitting that we had those 4 to close the show, really. So starting here, getting airborne, Paul Bonham in the Hawker Sea Fury. This aircraft again operated by Air Leasing for Graham Peacock's collection, painted in the markings of the prototype Sea Fury, which is why it's got this distinctive yellow undersides. And again, a classic Duxford backdrop. Joined in the sky by the Bearcat, the longest serving aircraft with the Fighter Collection. This aircraft arrived at Duxford in about 1984, 83, 84. A personal favourite of Stephen Gray, the founder of the Fighter Collection. He flew his last public display in this aeroplane about 10 years ago. And it continues to fly now with his son Nick and with other members of the Fighter Collection. Yes, you have a Bearcat at the CAF. I don't need to tell you about the Bearcat. It is the punchiest, the most dramatic of all the piston-powered fighters. Another aircraft from Graham Peacock's collection, operated by Air Leasing. This is the P-47 Thunderbolt. And this is Nellie B. And getting airborne here was Stu Goldspink at the controls, a personal favourite of Stu's. And following it into the air, the Corsair, flown by Brian Smith, FG-1D Corsair. This a Goodyear-built aeroplane in the markings of the British Fleet Air Arm. A very early aeroplane, actually got fabric control surfaces of the wing on this aeroplane. And again, been operational in UK at Duxford since 1988. So to close the show, having aeroplanes that have got that long synergy, that long personal connection with Duxford, I think was a great move. and they really treated us to a finale. You know, some of the best World War II warbird fighters flying some of the most powerful and dramatic aeroplanes. You know, in an October autumn evening in the sunshine, what's not to like? So it began with a 4-ship, really nice close formation from these guys. You can see there the yellow P on the side of the prototype markings on the Sea Fury. It's not a Sea Fury, it's actually an ex-Iraqi aeroplane, what was called the Iraqi single seat. So this was an aeroplane that was provided to the Iraqi Air Force, so it doesn't have a arrestor hook and it didn't have folding wings, although it's been restored as the prototype Sea Fury, and it does have, as you can see from the 5 propeller blades, the Bristol Centaurus engine. An increasing rarity even here in the UK now. So having done a 4-ship display, they broke into 2 pairs, and again with that beautiful light now from behind, up on the tank bank you get these glorious topside passes as the aircraft wheel around onto the B-axis. And to start with, this was, for me, I think probably the highlight of the 50th anniversary show, because this brought back memories of the 1990s for me. The mid to late 90s, an Iraqi single-seat Fury, not this one, but a different Fury, flown by the late, great Ray Hanna, with this very Bearcat flown by the still very much with us Stephen Gray. Stephen Gray, Ray Hanna, the best piston-powered fighters in a seemingly unchoreographed dogfight, was as good as display flying got. You know, you could tell there was real competition. You know, they're trying to get on each other's tails, just as good as it got. The 2 pilots at the top of their game flying the best aircraft. And to see these aircraft, so Paul Bonham, Jack Brown, flying these aircraft today, and they really did do that justice. Sea Fury, Bearcat, and even the Corsair and the P-47 got in on the act as well with tail chase aerobatics. Just glorious to see. And then as the sun is starting to set, getting those aircraft taxi past you on the tank bank, you can see the blue smoke here coming out the Sea Fury as that big Centaurus engine chugs its way back down the flight line. There's Stu Goldspink in the P-47, and Jackie in the Corsair, and Brian Smith there in the Bearcat taxiing in. And that effectively brought us to the end of a flying display. The last movement of the day, fittingly, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight pilot flying home to East Midlands Airport in the Rolls-Royce Spitfire. As I sit now, less than 3 miles, the crow flies in that direction, is East Midlands Airport. That's an aeroplane I see overhead here on a regular basis. It's whenever it's out on air test. The growl of a Spitfire, the growl of a Griffon Spitfire, even the dogs know to run outside because they know the Spitfire's coming. But I guess we should maybe in closing look back at what the 50th anniversary show achieved. And for me, it achieved great memories of pilots that have entertained us in the past. It gave us memories of aircraft that we've seen at previous shows. But there were a couple of, in my opinion, glaring gaps in the program, which could almost have been filled relatively easily. There have been a number of operators at Duxford over the course of the years. You know, we had some aeroplanes there from the fighter collection, but a name that's again always associated with Duxford is the Old Flying Machine Company. We spoke about Ray Hanna flying the Iraqi Fury in the 90s. The Old Flying Machine Company Spitfire MH434 has been based at Duxford since the early 1980s. And it's still there, but sadly it wasn't in this 50th anniversary display. And for me, that seemed like a shame. Likewise, Rob's Lamplow, one of the first collectors to move aircraft into Duxford, Yeah, P-51 Mustang Miss Helen, although not owned by Robs now, is owned by John Tyrrell and Robert Tyrrell, sorry. And that aeroplane is airworthy. It's based in Duxford, but it wasn't in the flying display. Likewise, what was the British Aerial Museum? It's now the Aircraft Restoration Company. We had their T6, but it would have been nice to have had some heavy metal. We know the Blenheim was at the end of the season. It would have been quite a big ask to get the Bristol Blenheim ready for the show, but there were a number of Spitfires that could have represented the Aircraft Restoration Company. Shuttleworth Spitfire, AR501, we saw that in the hangar being restored 50 years ago to the day. That airplane's airworthy. Would have been nice to have had that there. Likewise, the prototype Beagle Pup. It's not the greatest aeroplane in the world, but it's a historic aeroplane, and it's flying, and it was there 50 years ago. And perhaps, almost equally as glaring, we lost Caroline Grace this year, the leading female Spitfire display pilot of modern times. Caroline, her son Richard Air Leasing still operate the two-seat Spitfire ML407. It would have been nice to have had some recognition for Caroline at that 50th anniversary display. And again, where was the B-17? Where was Sally B? Based at Duxford, she started her winter maintenance 1 week before the show. So in conclusion, if I were to review the air show, if I was reviewing film, I'd say maybe 7 out of 10, 6 out of 10. Could do better. It was a great day. It was a great event. There were some relatively easy fixes that could have made it a 9 or a 10 out of 10. But you know what? It doesn't matter. Because 1992, I went to my first Duxford. Here I am in 2023 on the tank bank with my best friend. It's air shows. That's what we do this for. It's at the end of the day, it's the friendships we make, the network of contacts we make, and those were the things that will outlive any of the aeroplanes that were at Duxford that day. So thank you very much. I hope that was of interest to you, Steve.
It was. That was amazing. And now it just reinforces the fact that I need to get over there and get to that show, because it is, I would think of very, as you said, you are relatively close to the aircraft. It's a very intimate setting, as far as maybe in this country, a military show where you're set back quite a ways from the action. Very, like I said, intimate kind of experience.
It's an intimate experience in that you don't just see and hear the aeroplanes, you smell them. And I think that's one thing the CAF do very well, and a lot of these independent warbird collectors. You can go to a museum, you can see an aeroplane in a museum, but until you hear it and you smell it, it doesn't come to life. And I think that's the tangible thing. And yes, you see a Spitfire taxi past at Duxford, you see the Bristol Centaurus coughing out its blue smoke, and you get that whiff of the exhaust, and that's, for me, really brings these aircraft to life. And yes, you are close. There are 2 parallel runways at Duxford. There's the hard runway and also a grass runway, and you saw some of those photographs, particularly the Hurricane taking off straight towards you. That was taking off on the grass runway. So when you're on the tank bank, those aeroplanes are taking off very close to you, and there are not many airfields in the world where you will get that close to an aeroplane, and you almost feel it going overhead. It reverberates through your rib cage. It's a sensory experience. You have to come. You have to come, my friend.
All right. I think they should hire you as the tour director.
I'd gladly do it.
There you go. Well, Steve, thank you so very much for sharing not only pictures of this year's show, the 50th anniversary show, and the one that was in 1973, but also the history of the airfield itself. Really appreciate all the work that you put into pulling this all together, and certainly always enjoy having you as a guest on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure, Steve. And unfortunately, I will not be at Oshkosh this year, so this has to be our annual catch-up. So.
There we go. All right. Well, thanks again. And that will wrap up tonight's show. Remember, if you would just take a minute to like, share, or subscribe to our videos, we'd appreciate it. And if you're subscribing on YouTube, click the bell icon and you'll get notifications when the new shows are posted. If you have any thoughts on tonight's show or any of our shows, please send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. And until next time, for the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.